Hi guys, I sat down to film a June reading wrap up a couple of times in the last week, but every time I looked at the list of books that I would have to talk about, all motivation flew right out of me and I just couldn't be bothered. I don't really want to talk about Exposure by Helen Dunmore, which is a dull Cold War spy novel with cliched miserable communists as the anti-heroes and a good measure of Holocaust porn thrown in to raise the sales numbers, and I'm just not here for that, and I didn't even finish the book. I don't really have a whole lot to say about Inspector Imanishi Investigates by Seichou Matsumoto either, except that as a murder mystery, it's really good at painting a great panorama of Japanese society in the 1960s, but it has some red herring issues which really irked me because they were on the structural level. And also its 1960s Japanese view of women and women's place in society and their mental capabilities does not want to make me give the author a lot of screen time on my channel. And I have little to say about internet darling Yuri Herrera, except that I thought his first book, Trabajos del Reino, Kingdom Cons in the English translation, I think is a mildly interesting play with words and form. It's a narco corrido in book form, war, color my mind blown, but I thought it lacked any honest depth and humanity, and nothing about what actually happens in the story is anything other than stereotypical. For me, it was quite obvious that that the book was written in this way in order to please the kind of people who hand out literary awards. And it succeeded in that regard. But it doesn't really offer anything beyond that. There is no depth beyond the surface cleverness, I thought. And the two romance novels that I read in June were a bit meh as well. The first one, Foxen by Parker Hoy, started out delightfully weird and original in its voice as well as its plot, with one of the two love interests being a forest god. But then it quickly degenerated into just candy floss romance with the weird forest god turning into a lovesick schoolboy and the two main characters literally skipping across the meadows holding hands, which granted is weird as heck, but not in a good way. And Tommy Cabot was here by Sebastian, which is set in 1950s Boston, has great atmosphere and a very sweet couple, and is far less cliched in every respect than Cat Sebastian's Regency era romances. But it suffers from a dual perspective that takes all suspense right out of it from the beginning and makes it so that you don't actually have to read the book because you know everything about the characters' feelings, the nature of their feelings, and the motivations for their actions right from the beginning, and it makes it so that you know every step of the way to their happy ending. So let's just concentrate on the highlights of my reading month in this video, okay? And in the future, I'm thinking about filming more single book review videos, either long ones or short ones, of the good books that I read when I've just read them, and just ignore the meh ones. I might film wrap-ups now and then of recently read offensively bad books though, because that is always fun. So there are two books that stood out for me in June, and one of them is actually my favorite read of the year so far, which you will already know what it is if you've watched my mid-year book freakout tag video. So let's start with the other one. And it's a Japanese one. It's The Stones Cry Out by Hikaru Okuizumi, translated into English by James Westerhoven. And this is a story about war trauma and the effects, the long-term effects that it can have on the afflicted persons and also their immediate environment, i.e. their family. The protagonist is a soldier, a Japanese soldier who survived the Japanese operations on the Philippines in the Second World War, where in the end the Japanese troops scattered before the American army. But as always, they refused to surrender, and well, the idea was to fight until the bitter end, but in reality, they were more or less just hiding and holding out in caves until the bitter end and watching their comrades die all around them from exposure and from lack of food and lack of medical supply, and horrendous scenes went down in these caves. And back in Japan, the protagonist develops an obsession for geology and hunting for rocks because that was a passion of one of his dying comrades who told him all about the magic of stones in that cave where they were hiding. And after his return to Japan and his release back into normal life, geology and his obsession with it provide solace for his troubled mind, and his single-minded focus on it make it so that there is no room in his mind for thoughts about the horrors that he witnessed. This also creates a prison for his mind, though, and as you can see in this very subtle symbolization on the cover, it prevents him from bridging the gap between his soldier's life in the past and a future that he might have in his civilian life with the family that he has created. But more than that, the thing is also, just as with rocks who have a habit of resurfacing after some time has passed and making geological history visible to the human eye, so it is with trauma. In one way or another, it comes up again and maybe even erupts. And so it is in this case too. This is an incredibly sad story, which also makes you angry on behalf of these people who are sent into war and then afterwards just released back into civilian life without any kind of psychological support and supervision, or even just debriefing about the horrors that they might have witnessed or even committed. It's a very short little book, but a very powerful one. But my favorite book of June, and really of the year so far, is another Spanish one. It's Tengo, Miedo, Torero by Pedro Lemebel, which was translated into English under the title My Tender Matator. This is just an extremely cleverly, creatively, originally written short novella, but unlike in the case of Yuri Herrera, this one feels effortless. Its cleverness feels effortless and like it's just coming from an extremely original mind, and there is a whole lot of heart in it besides as well. This was written in 1991 and it is set in 1986 in Santiago de Chile, and it's set in the context of a rebellion against the dictatorship and a failed assassination attempt on the dictator Pinochet. In its center is the story of an aging queen who falls in love with a student who uses her house as a meeting venue for his cell of insurgents and uses it to store weapons for the assassination attempt. This protagonist went through a lot in her childhood and youth, but she is a very resilient creature and she infuses her life with a lot of theatrical drama to counteract all the sadness, and she always has a song on her lips, and this gives the novella the feeling of a musical almost. And another thing that makes the story funnier and livelier and more poignant at the same time is that we also get to hear from the perspective of the other side, namely the rich and powerful people in the upper city who run the country, including the dictator Pinochet himself and his wife, who really steals the show from him and who drives him nearly mad with her constant inane chattering. And she, more than anybody else, just personifies the obliviousness of the ruling class and the privilege and their complete cluelessness when it comes to the realities of life for the normal people. And the narrative flits from perspective to perspective and from direct speech to free indirect speech to just normal third person report in really masterfully smooth transitions. And this is one of the cases in which the lack of quotation marks is more than just an empty aesthetic choice because it's fashionable. But in this case, it really serves a function. It makes these smooth transitions possible, and the result is just a wild ride. And on the story front, again, this is actually one of my favorite things, this juxtaposition and this depiction of seemingly absurd personal drama against the backdrop of the objectively higher drama of a revolution. But this makes you see the personal dimensions of historical events. And I also just loved its biting humor, which is coupled with so much warmth and compassion for the main character. And it has you laughing out loud in one paragraph and crying ugly tears in the next. It's just all in all a marvelous piece of writing, I think. And yeah, that made it my favorite book of the year. I have read another book since the end of June, though, that I'm pretty sure will end up on my best books of the year list at the end of the year. And I will tell you all about that in one of the many single book reviews that I fully intend to film in the near future. And I also have plans for a somewhat special book haul that will be coming up. And then, of course, there is still my recent nonfiction wrap up that I need to film because I've read a lot of interesting nonfiction lately. So that is what you can expect from me and this channel in the near future. As always, I'd love to hear from you if you have read any of the books that I mentioned in this video. I think my reading has been a little bit, my reading choices have been a little bit obscure lately, but I think at least Tengo, Miedo, Torero, my Tender Matator, is having a bit of a revival lately. So perhaps some of you have even read it already, but if not, you heard it here first. Okay, that's it for today. Bye.